My father was George Arthur Padmore Jr., and his parents, uh, Edith May Wiles Padmore and George Arthur Padmore Sr., um, were both, I think, descendants of people who settled from Barbados who settled in Crozierville. So my great grandparents were uh, James Stanley Padmore and Mary, I think it might have been Louise Barclay. Those were the parents of George Arthur Padmore Sr. And I believe they settled in Crozierville. And I'm not sure about the Wiles, if they settled in Crozierville as well. But many great memories about my grandparents, because at least up until the time we left Liberia, their house was like this, mostly the center of my world as a child, because that was where we always went to hook up with all of our cousins. They had 5 sons, and many of them lived in Monrovia at the time, and they had children around our ages. So lots of Christmas pageants that we would do right there in their house in Syncor. All the kids would come up with a show, and we would have to sing or dance or do something, and we would do it right there on their porch in front of all of the adults after we had had time to practice. And Christmas time in Monrovia at my grandparents' house are some of the best memories that I have, including putting together they were like mesh Christmas stockings that you would have to staple, and we would have candy and toys and things like that, and we would fill them up so that my grandmother could take them up to Crozierville sometime over the holiday. So those are some of my fondest memories involving my grandparents. My grandmother was just an amazing person, both in terms of public service. My grandfather was also, he was ambassador to the US, and she served in that role as, the ambassador's wife, hosting all kinds of important dignitaries. But even before that, as I understand it, she was an informal member of President Tubman's cabinet. She had a role in his administration. It was not a cabinet level role, but she was an advisor to President Tubman. And then later, when President Talbert took over, she was the first female cabinet member, I think, in the history of the country. I believe she was Secretary of the Ministry of Health, maybe. So just fantastic. And then in terms of their business ventures, maybe he was biased, but my father would say she was really the driver of their business ventures, especially regarding their rubber farm. That she personally, and they both did, bought hundreds of acres of farmland. They planted the farms. She personally helped to tend to the farm. And she was just a very sophisticated person in terms of business acumen, just very smart and pushing all the time to come up with new and different ways, different ventures, while at the same time, thinking about how to take care of people. She was very mindful about the people that worked for them in all of their business ventures. So I know I keep saying she. My grandfather did great things too, but he got to write a book and talk about himself. So a lot of people know about his accomplishments because they were more publicly known than the accomplishments of my grandmother. So I didn't really get to know my grandfather until after the coup, when we were all living over here, and they got a place in Delaware near us. And it was probably the most time I had really spent in his company, because he was always working, or he's very quiet, and he would continue to be a pretty quiet person. But when you got him talking, he had so many great stories and just this kind of dry sense of humor that I really came to appreciate. Um, he was a very proper person. One of my favorite things about Big Daddy was, and that's what we all called him, Big Daddy, was even when he didn't have anywhere to go, he would wake up in the morning, usually at a pretty early hour. You come downstairs, going to school. He and my grandmother are staying in the house all day. They're not going anywhere. He would be down there in his white button-down shirt, perfectly pressed. His belt, his slacks. He may not have on shoes. He may have on, some socks with some leather slippers, but he was always ready. If somebody came by the house, he would never be embarrassed to say, oh, this is my grandfather, George Arthur Padmore Sr. He was just a very proper person. And I just enjoyed that. He loved cards. He and my grandmother, and then when my mother's mother stayed with us, and the three of them, getting together and telling stories and laughing, it was fantastic having all three of them together in the house at the same time. And he had a lot of history. And if you sat down, you just think about the remarkable things. And like I said, he wrote a book. He was there at the founding of the United Nations. I mean, he was present. I think it was called the League of Nations at the time, but he was there as a representative for Liberia. And he was just so knowledgeable about these things that so few people in the world would be able to say that they experienced firsthand. So that was really remarkable. And if you could get him talking about it, you could really, really learn a lot. He was not a perfect person, but one thing that I learned about my grandfather, especially in the years that he lived with us, and especially after my grandmother passed away, was that although, sometimes they were many times at odds with each other, he really, really loved his wife. And that was very clear to me, and I think to anybody who spent enough time with the two of them. And she adored him, and he loved his wife. Okay. It was after my grandmother passed away and my grandfather had remarried. And we were visiting him and his new wife, and they had been married for a while. And I don't remember how or why the subject came up. I'm sure they were not speaking to me. I'm sure they were speaking to my parents. And he had had some health problems. And so his wife was saying how they had talked about, his health and what his wishes were, whenever he was to pass away. And he said, and she just said it in such a simple, you almost would have missed it if you weren't paying attention. She said, oh yeah, well, he said, when he dies, he wants to be buried next to his wife. And then she paused. Mrs. Padmore. She was Mrs. Padmore, but we all knew who she was talking about. Can you imagine? Here is this woman who was taking care of him every single day. I mean, she told us in a room full of people. She told us that he was sitting right there. These were words coming from Miss Paulita. She said it. She told us that that's what he told her he wanted. That made it even better. It wasn't him talking, it was her talking. So my grandmother, I mean, she just had a personality larger than life. She really had an incredible sense of style, great taste in food, dress, just everything. She loved her kids, she loved her grandkids. She never made any bones about that. It was always very clear to all of us. She was an extremely generous person. You know, I always experienced her as being this incredibly kind and warm person. When she had a lot and when she didn't have a lot. That was just what I always remember about her. I loved and enjoyed, I don't know why it always sticks out to me, but kind of the partnership that she had with Mr. Noah, who was their cook and sort of the main keeper of their house and the farm. And I've heard so many stories from my dad about Mr. Noah. And then when I was a child, I just remember he was like the keeper of all the great things in the pantry. Their house was like the next best thing to going to America. At least that's the way I thought about it, because they always had these fancy treats and snacks that we just couldn't find anywhere else. And they were in the pantry. The pantry wasn't locked, but Mr. Noah was the keeper of the kitchen, and we were afraid of him. Clear to me, even back then as a child, how much respect. And I think maybe that's what struck me, is because at least back then in Liberia, the interactions that I often saw between, you know, people who had and people who were serving them, there wasn't a huge, you know, it was go and get this for me. I mean, there wasn't like this high level of respect for people who were working for you as a servant or as a domestic worker in your home. I just didn't see that anywhere else except at my grandmother's house. The way that she spoke to Mr. Noah, and frankly, the other people who worked for her, I never heard her speak harshly. She always treated them with respect. And it was like she showed them the respect that they were showing her. And that made a big impression on me about, you know, how people should be treated, no matter who they are. So that was something that I thought made her a great lady. Not just all of her accomplishments and accolades, but the way that she treated people. She really was a great person. And then later, when they came, you know, again, really got to know both of them when they were living with us for a while in Delaware. And then they got an apartment there eventually. So we spent a lot of time with each other. It was wonderful having someone other than my mother who helped to guide me, you know, maybe in a little bit gentler way. You know, she overheard me saying something that she didn't think was quite appropriate for a young girl to say or do or even think. She would correct me. Oh, no. You have plenty of time for that. I find myself saying those things now. Now that I'm a mother of a tween. But it takes me back to those days in Delaware when, you know, it was just us, and I was just happy to have that guidance. I'm sure my parents were happy to have reinforcements, having them around. So we really missed them when they finally left Delaware and went back to Liberia. So my father, George Arthur Padmore Jr., was trained professionally as a lawyer, but for the first half of my life, well, not the first half, the first fifth of my life so far, he was working mainly as the general manager of LAL, Liberia Amusements Limited, a company that his father started with some other business partners. I believe it was in the form of a corporation. But they held a large number of the shares, and my father was basically running the day-to-day operations of LAL, which ran the Relda movie theater in Monrovia, and they also operated other movie theaters around town. And so when I entered the scene, that's how I knew him, as the guy who ran the cool movie theater. And we got to go as his children with our friends and cousins to the movies at the Relda. And we got to watch the movies from this little box in his office where we could get, snacks, and it was so much fun. So he was the movie guy. And then before anybody else had ever even heard of it, next thing I knew, he also had a law practice, a small law practice, and it seemed like he took cases now and then, but his main job was as general manager of LAL. But he continued his practice of law. He started a movie rental business. I'm thinking it was the first and only of its kind at the time. And that was when those Betamax and VHS tapes came out that don't even exist anymore. And so he started renting these Betamax and the VHS tapes as part of, the broader entertainment business. He was also part owner of The Wave, one of the coolest nightclubs in town, if you let them tell it. I think it was owned by either an international group or some foreigners, and then this group of friends, which included my dad and his crowd mates, they ended up buying it and taking it over and running The Wave. Now, the story is that my mother came up with the name The Wave, which stood for Winston, Arthur, Varsi, and Estrada, the friends who bought the nightclub and operated it. So he had that going on. It wasn't a business, but his passion was jazz. Anybody who knew my father knew that he was very passionate about jazz. And he had a radio show called Music for Moderns. And he used to tape that radio show right out of his study in our house in Liberia. And that is one of my fondest memories as a child, was whenever me and my sister would get to sit in the study while he was taping his show and listen to him, play his music and be the jazz DJ for Music for Moderns. I think I've covered those were the early days. So he went to school in the States for high school when his parents were in DC as ambassador and wife. And then he went to college at Brown University, and then he started law school at Boston University. And then, at least the way he told it, when he decided he wanted to go back home, he thought, well, what's the point of sticking it out and getting an American law degree when I'm never planning to live in this country? So he left Boston and finished his law degree in Liberia, and which was fine. So he was licensed and he was, like I said, practicing law. But having that legal training really served him well after the coup, because when we came back over here, I remembered he really struggled to find work. It was, 1980. He had a law degree. He had undergraduate from a Ivy League school, and he was a Black man who had just turned 40. And it was really hard for him to get a job. He really, really struggled. He sold insurance for a little bit. Not a strength, selling insurance, but he made a good living out of it. I mean, he really, made a go of it. But he eventually really settled into, kind of came into his own when he got a job as with the Public Utilities Commission for the state of Delaware, where we were living. And it was just, divine intervention is what I say, because at the time, I think Delaware was one of the only states, maybe there was one other, and this is coming from him, that didn't require someone to be a licensed lawyer to serve as a hearing examiner. You're basically serving as an administrative law judge over utility rates cases. And so you couldn't really do this job without a law degree, but they just said they didn't require it. And there were probably less than a handful of states that allowed you to take this job without being a licensed attorney. Because he had looked into possibly going back to law school, because in the US, in order to practice here, even though he had been a practicing attorney in Liberia, because he didn't graduate from an accredited law school, from a US accredited law school, the only way he could have practiced law, like at a law firm, would have been if he had gone back to law school. So at that time, I think he was regretting that he hadn't stuck it out at Boston and gotten an American law degree, because then he could have just gone to work for a law firm, or at least started his own law firm. But, you know, things worked out as they probably should. So he got this job with the Public Utilities Commission, and did that job for decades and did it extremely well, so much so that the governor of the state of Delaware eventually appointed him as the public advocate for the state of Delaware, who advocates almost like a public defender on behalf of all of the, you know, customers of utilities in the state of Delaware. Just a huge honor for my dad. So it all worked out as it should, and he ended up being very successful, or as my mother says, cream always rises to the top. Yeah, my parents definitely taught us, and me in particular, the importance of education. You know, they really prioritized that, not just in what they said, but what they did. You know, the sacrifices that they made to make sure that we, all three of us, got the best possible education that they could afford to give us. So both in words and their own actions, you know, they really stressed the importance of education. They, especially my dad, because I think he just loves history and he loved his family. They taught us the importance of understanding our history, you know, and it didn't just start after the coup, after we came to America and everybody was kind of displaced, but it became very important then. But even before that, I mean, I remember in Liberia, whatever year it was that Roots came out, they made us watch that Roots miniseries. It must have been like 3 or 4 days straight. We had to sit in their rooms, in their bedroom in Liberia, and watch the series, because my dad especially thought it was very important for us to understand that history. And it was hard for us at the time, living in Liberia and not having any real connection to the US, but it really served us well later just to have that background in that context. So just knowing your history, knowing where you came from and why things are the way they are, you know, was always important. I also thought it was important, at least in our home, I never felt like my parents tried to shield us from the truth, even when it wasn't pretty, you know, about things that could have been better or different in Liberia, especially after the fact. It wasn't just, oh, you know, we were all victims and things, you know, it was, let's take a look at how we ended up where we are. And I thought that was a really important thing, an important lesson. They always, they taught us the importance of family and, you know, keeping family close and being supportive and loyal. Both of them, especially probably after we came to the States, maybe they had grown in their own faith, but they really helped us to prioritize, you know, church, and if not church specifically, but having some kind of a relationship with God. That was something that I learned from both of my parents in different ways. You know, my father, who was never like an outwardly religious person, he wasn't somebody who was always talking about, you know, oh, God, 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 but in his actions, every Sunday went to church, no questions asked. He eventually got very involved in the vestry at St. John's Episcopal Church in Delaware, where we went, and he eventually became the senior warden there. And when it came time, and the rector at my church here in St. Louis asked me to be a senior warden, the first thing I did was I called my dad and I said, they want me to be senior warden, me. What do you think? And he said, oh, you should do it. It's an honor. You're like an advisor, a counselor to your rector. You can't say that. I actually taught Sunday school for years before I became a regular churchgoer. Like when I was coming out of law school, I went to the cathedral here in St. Louis, and I would teach Sunday school because it was something I did. You know, we were very involved at St. John. We were in the choir. We all went to Sunday school. We went through confirmation classes. I was in the youth group. I went to Camp Arrowhead, which was the Episcopal Church's like their summer camp. I went there until finally the people said, Shirley, you don't want to be a counselor, you know, you driving the camp. I said, no, I want to be a camper. Mother's best qualities were a lot. I think a lot like his mother, he was a very generous-hearted person who was extremely loyal to friends and family alike, great intellect, great sense of humor. And I guess when I say generosity, he had this generosity of spirit that that made everybody that he encountered feel seen, you know, like for who they are and accepted. And he really, really did that with all of us, with his kids. I mean, I just remember from the time that I can remember, he always made it very clear that he didn't have favorites. You know, and some parents say that, but you're not so sure because of the way they act sometimes, if they really mean it. But he really lived that. He was very, very true to that. It was like each one of us had a special gift in his eyes, and we saw that and we felt that. And I think that's a very unique quality. I don't think people might feel that way, but not everybody's able to express it in a way that other people can feel it and see it, you know. So in everything he said and did, that really, really came through. And that's probably, to me, one of his greatest qualities. To me, quick wit is a mark of very high intelligence. You know, but as far as, we all thought he walked on water. So it's like, I could go on for days. Just, you know, here's a man who could listen to a jazz piece and play it on the piano by ear. I mean, that takes a special level of, and I don't mean like, oh, intellectually smart, but there is a special intelligence there that, you know, it's a creative intelligence. So he had like academic intelligence, but he had creative intelligence and very high emotional intelligence. And I just think it's really rare. So he was wonderful. He's the reason that I became a lawyer. He's the reason that I became a judge. Yeah, he definitely, I'm not saying that my mother had no impact, but he had a huge impact on who I am. I mean, when people would ask me about, in fact, often I'm asked to talk to students, law students, high school students about my career path. You know, people say, well, what drew you to the law? And I always start off by saying, well, you know, everybody gets to the law by different paths. With me, it was subliminal messaging from my father. Because from a very young age, he used to say, oh, you make a good lawyer, you like to argue, or, oh, you make a good lawyer, you ask a lot of questions, you're very inquisitive. And so the first time that I can remember anybody asking me, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? I didn't even think about it. I said, a lawyer. So that, I mean, he really planted the seed in making me, it wasn't even a question. It was just, of course, right? And then just, you know, just living with someone, you know, like my dad, who had an incredible memory, who was extremely well-read, who had a passion for history, all kinds of history. You know, he had a clear grasp on Western civilization and Western democracies and how they form and what it meant. I mean, we were able to have in-depth discussions about that. So I don't think it should be a big surprise to anyone that I have a passion for the law and understanding how things work and policies, because I had fantastic conversations with my dad growing up about all these things. And, you know, it was like, you could ask him a question and he almost always seemed to have an answer. I mean, he was like a walking encyclopedia. So of course you want to emulate that, you know, I want to be like that guy. So he's had a huge, huge influence on me. I remember the Christmases. I remember being at Big Mommy and Big Daddy's house in Singapore and having the country devil come to dance on Christmas Day, like at the house, and just how awesome that was. Even though I got confused because it was a country devil, but they also called him Santa Claus. So I was a little bit afraid of Santa Claus because I wasn't quite sure, was Santa Claus good? Or was he the devil? So I wasn't quite sure about that. But I remember I actually have very clear memories about Liberia, probably more like from 7 to 10. Some of the things that really jump out are, today they would call them play dates, but you know, my friend Tanya Dennis, who was like family, going to her house and doing tea parties, you know, in her room, and then going out in the backyard and catching frogs and trying to stick them to her well, to the top of the well. And I remember that. And today, you couldn't get me anywhere near a frog. So I remember that, and I can't believe that I'm that same child, because I would never do that today. I remember third grade at Lutheran. I will never forget it. At Lutheran school, I was in third grade, and there was a math problem that we had for homework. And the teacher was calling us up to put the answers on the board one by one. And there was this one problem everybody seemed to have gotten wrong. And so people would come up and write the answer, and she would say no. And if it was wrong, she would tell the students to go stand over there in front of the board. And after a while, there was a pretty good line of kids. And then she called on me. I think she was just going in either seat order or alphabetical order. So she called me. I went up with my homework paper. I wrote my answer on the board, and I was right. And my reward for getting it right was that she wanted me to beat all of my friends who had gotten the answer wrong and were standing there in front of them. Is that a way to motivate children? You can see I'm still traumatized about it to this day, because I'm telling you about something that happened to me in third grade. And I went to the first girl, and it was Garmin Dennis. I still remember. And I was like, and I hit my hand, and she started crying, and I started crying, and the teacher got mad, and she took the stick from me, tossed it down. And then she beat all the other kids. The good news is I didn't stay at Lutheran very long. Christine Norman and Sadie DeShields opened up Isaac David. It started right after that, and then that's where I went, and that's where I was when the coup happened. I mean, maybe there's a child in the class that would have motivated, but I was not that child, and the teacher was very frustrated by that. Where, you know, we had to wear a uniform. And if you come and your socks falling down, then they come and they're beating your legs, telling you, pull your socks up. But they keep beating you while you're supposed to reach down and pull. My parents did, but my father never beat us. Never. My mother, though, but it wasn't fair because she had to be the disciplinarian. But in Liberia, I don't remember her doing any beating. But the nurses were allowed to beat us, and they did. And they did. Yes. Or nanny. They would call her a nanny over here. Mm-hmm. Wow. And it was usually when they were cornrowing your hair. And it's hurting because they're making it tight. And so you're moving around and take the cool, stop moving. And now you're crying and moving. And they're getting more angry. And so I said, oh, Mary, You want some Kool-Aid? She thought it was the dry Kool-Aid because back then we would put the Kool-Aid, just eat it dry. She thought it was Kool-Aid. So I put it in her hand and she started licking and started popping. Oh my goodness. She was jumping. She was screaming. Ah, she thought I was trying to kill her. I ran away and I didn't let her beat me, but she was so afraid of the Pop Rocks that she let me go and I didn't get a beating. I thought it was hilarious. Probably at different times, I would say my dad, and at different times, my mother, in like life skills, just being a mother, especially after I got older. And then some a teacher in I have a couple of teachers in high school who were in Delaware at Friends who were just extraordinary teachers who really helped me, and then in college. So at Friends, my math teacher from 10th grade on, Mrs. Holmes, was just great. She really encouraged me. She gave me confidence in my math skills. And it was really thanks to her that I ended up, taking advanced and accelerated math in high school. And then I had a great English teacher in high school, also was like an advanced or honors, I think they called it honors English. And he just like took my love for reading and literature to another level. And because of him, I wanted to be an English major when I went to college. And my mother was like, oh, that's not practical unless you're teaching. What do you do something more practical? And I was like, okay. So then I went and got signed up to do political science. Now, that's not practical either. I could have been an English major. I said, well, so what am I going to do? Be a political scientist? There's no such thing. It didn't matter because I was going to law school and I could have done any major, but it was fine. I'm glad I did political science, actually, because I learned a lot about government and how it works. I think that both of my parents also just instilled in me, not just, education, but just always doing your best, no matter what you do. So my motivation to succeed really came from them always pushing all of us to do our best. I think I'm just really lucky because, I like to think that even if I had ended up not loving the law, I still would have worked hard to do my best. But the truth is, I ended up in a profession that I do love and I do care about. So it's not hard. To me, what is just doing what I love, making sure I understand the law, it's just all part of it. Like I'm getting paid to do something that I really, truly enjoy. So it doesn't feel like work. And I really enjoyed it when I was practicing law. I thought it was great. I love learning about different, areas of the law. And that was fun as a litigator. I really got to learn interesting and complicated technologies because I may not be learning about the law, but I might be learning about, how big agricultural giants like Monsanto, which now has been bought by Bayer, all of that technology, because there would be lawsuits around their technology to protect it. So just learning, you have to learn so many different things to figure out how does the law apply in this space. So it's like a life of learning. It's almost like the next best thing to some of those people who love being in academia forever. This is the next best thing because you're constantly learning new things. And I just really enjoyed that. It always satisfied my sense of curiosity about the world and how things work. And if there's a problem, how can we fix it? There's always an answer. There's always a way to solve this. And so, to have that be my job is to problem solve. I mean, I love it. And they're going to pay me to figure it out. So I enjoyed it when I was practicing, and it's just on another level as a judge, because not only am I getting to do what I love, but there's a whole layer of public service that's added to it, where I'm doing what I love in a space where I really have an opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, and it might be small by, little small means here and there, but it really is very meaningful work. For little Black girls in Africa or the Caribbean or Barbados specifically, or here in the United States who think they might want to be a judge one day, absolutely pursue it, because it's doable. But first, you have to really have a genuine interest in learning about the law, in figuring out ways to problem solve. Because if you love being a lawyer, you'll really love being a judge, I think. Not everybody. There are people who like the fight of litigation. They like to be advocates, and they think that it's harder to be a judge where you have to be neutral. But the best thing you can do is study the law. See if you love it. If you love it, you're definitely on the right professional. As a Black woman who is a professional in a profession that has been one of the slowest to diversify, right? I definitely had obstacles that I definitely did not recognize. Let's put it like that. I think that my advice would be to intentionally turn a blind eye sometimes to those obstacles. In other words, make people's racism and sexism, which just exists if you're going to be practicing in this country, especially if you want to be in the practice of law in private practice, working at a law firm. That's where they've been the slowest to diversify. I think it's important to make issues like racism, sexism, the other people's problem. Because if you believe in yourself, which I did, I had a great foundation. I had a father who, from the time I was talking, was telling me, you'd be a great lawyer. So when I came to this country and went to law school and started practicing law, and people started doing what young people today would say are microaggressions, making assumptions about my ability based on how I looked, I didn't even recognize it at first. And that's because it never occurred to me that anyone would question my competence. And especially not just from looking at me, because of the way that I was raised. And so not everybody is fortunate enough to have been brought up in that way, where they left home with a very high level of confidence, but you need to make sure that you believe in yourself and you surround yourself with people who believe in you, so that when the microaggressions come, because they're coming, you're equipped to deal with it. And just remember, that person's belief based on what? Nothing, is more of a reflection of them and their limitations than it is of any limitations you have. How would they possibly know? But I had it a lot. I never let it knock me off my game, because I always perceived it as, they're crazy. Yeah. So when people would think that I was the court reporter or the secretary, I mean, in my practice, I represented some big companies. And there were times when I would have to travel. I would be by myself with a client representative, a white man, an older white man would be the client representative. I'm the lawyer representing the big company. And we would show up sometimes in the small towns in Shreveport, Louisiana, and or Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I would have my big boxy briefcase, which I needed to carry big legal files in, and it had my SAP initials. I'm carrying the roller bag. I'm dressed like a lawyer, and people were like, "Where's the lawyer?" Or they would start talking to the client who was not a lawyer, assuming he must be the lawyer. And we say, "Oh, no, Shirley, Shirley, you're the lawyer for Olin Corporation?" "Yes." "Are you guys ready to start?" But I didn't, all the better if you underestimate me. But I just think it's important to make sure that you remember that, slights, they're a reflection of the mindset of the slighter, not you, not your limitations. So, brought up as a second-class citizen, when the slights and the slings and the arrows come, we react differently to that. And that in turn generates a different reaction from them. So when, I've had Black Americans say, "You are treated differently from us." It's absolutely true. And so that's why, like at my old law firm, I would say, look, it's not fair to put the diversity and the diversifying, to put that burden on the minority lawyers. You, the majority, the firm, you guys have to make a commitment that you're going to make changes culturally, because the truth is, they do treat me differently, but they treat me differently because I react differently. They don't have the same, it's an unspoken code. And when they realize that I don't know the code, it's like, oh, there's like relief from the white people. Like, oh, I can talk to her. There's no guilt. We can have a conversation about it without me getting all puffed up, or I don't have all this baggage that I'm carrying with me. But that's not to their credit. Person who's getting all mad, you have an understanding as to why they're having that reaction without you just having a knee-jerk reaction, because it's a relationship. It's not just on one person. But they used to say that to me at my old law firm, or different people at different times would say, "Oh, we need to hire 20 more Shirleys." I'm like, "So what you mean is you need 20 more African immigrants, who grew up in a more privileged background and they're not carrying baggage." I think that getting a good education and getting yourself equipped, whether you ultimately love the profession or not, but getting yourself in a position to maximize your choices in terms of what kind of work you do after you're done with school. That's the first thing. So you want to make sure that you position yourself to make a high income. That's number one, to build wealth, right? And you can only do that in this country by getting a really good education at the lowest possible cost. So avoid huge student loans, especially unless you really have a good idea of what are you going to be earning when you come out. So make sure the investment in your education isn't going to outpace your ability to pay for that education once you graduate, because being saddled with student loan debt is something that I experienced because I didn't think anything about the debt. I just knew I was going to be a lawyer, I was going to make money, but you're not going to make that much money, right? So you have to really balance that. I'm just an extremely lucky person that I came out right at a time with the .com industry was growing, and apparently they started stealing talent from the law schools. People started dropping out of law school and going or leaving law firms to go work for .com companies, and all of that in a very short period of time after I graduated quickly put pressure on the law firms to pay lawyers at law firms a lot more money than they had been paying them. So in less than a 6-year period, my starting salary as a lawyer at one of the larger firms in St. Louis almost doubled in like 6 years. And that was through no doing of mine. It just happened to be the time in the market. And that made a big impact on me. So one of the things that I started doing almost right away, it's the only piece of financial advice that I followed. Everything else I did was a disaster when it came to money at that time, was to maximize my 401k. I started, somebody at the firm told me to watch Susie Orman. She was big at the time. She had been on Oprah, and and so that was the only Susie Orman advice that I followed, was I maximized my 401k. And I am so glad that I did that. I mean, once during the 17 years or so, I broke one of the Susie Orman rules, and I borrowed some money from my 401k to buy a place or something, and which they said you should never borrow that money. You're borrowing it against your future. But so get as high as an income as you can. Remember the debt. Keep your debt load low. Save. Even if you don't have the money to, open up a savings account and actively save money, put money towards your retirement as early as you possibly can. It has been hugely rewarding. It's one of the reasons why when I had the opportunity to become a judge, I could actually afford to do it, because I actually, unlike people who were, in the public sector as prosecutors and other things, for them, becoming a judge is like a promotion. You're getting more money, you're getting more prestige. For me, I was already an equity partner at a law firm. I took a pay cut to become a judge because private practice pays more than public sector work. But I could afford to do it because I had been socking money away almost from the first day I started working. And that really helped. Now, of course, it helped that, I married somebody who is extremely financially savvy. He and I met at a time that I was trying to reduce my debt. And so my big advice there is, avoid the mistakes I made, which is spending money. I mean, I was making a lot of money, but I was spending a lot of money. And so, yes, I had a good salary. I wasn't managing my debt very well. I was allowing myself to have debt that I was paying over time. But I had more than enough money to pay my bills and still have a good time. And so when I met Paul, it was very obvious to me that he did not want to marry somebody who was going to bring a lot of debt into the marriage. So Paul, this really made me love him even more, put me on a debt reduction plan, because he was like, you make more than enough money. There's no reason why look at all this interest. So he actually had me go through the exercise of sitting down and putting on a chart all the debt I had, like revolving credit card debt. I had a car note. I still had student loans. He was like, how have you been practicing law for all these years and you still have student loans? There's no excuse for it. Because I would just pay the minimum amount. And he stressed to me, and really for the first time that anybody had talked to me about money in that way, about what it was actually costing me to carry that debt, right? The finance charges. It's like I had paid some of those loans 2, 3, 4 times over because I was just paying the minimum amount every month because I wanted to have as much disposable income as I could to play with. And I didn't understand what that was actually costing me. It's like one purse, one expensive purse. You pay on credit card and you don't pay it off right away. You pay like that for that purse 5 or 6 times over the course of a 2-year period. So the only people getting rich are the banks. And so when he laid it all out, and so we came up with this plan, I had a car note and I had some revolving credit cards. And he said, here's what we'll do. He sorted the chart, and at the very top of the chart was the debt that carried the highest interest rate. And the plan was to get a 0% credit card and transfer that debt to that 0% credit card. It was one of those back then when they would say 0% APR for 1 year. And he was like, that's your timeline. You have 1 year to pay off this debt, because what you're doing is you're stopping the finance charges for 1 year. And so I paid it all off. And then when that debt was paid, I took the money that had been going to the debt at the top and I went to the next one. And in a very short period of time, I had paid off all my debt. And I've actually never had revolving debt since then. So that's my advice. Manage that debt. Try to live within your means, but it's more important to not, I mean, you should live within your means. Try to avoid spending more than you can pay off every month. Use credit cards wisely, which I didn't do in the beginning, but I do now. So we only do credit cards that give us benefits like miles or cash back or something. And we pay off our credit cards every month. And it's been, and invest. I mean, I was not an investor. Paul happens to, that's what, some men like to buy cars and electronics, and Paul likes to buy stock, thankfully. So that's been very good for me. But just paying attention to those things, which a lot of us don't do because we don't know, we're not educated about it. But understanding the time value of money is something that we can all use good education on. Another thing, and I didn't mention this, but one of the things that really, to Paul's credit, I think for a lot of us, money and debt and all of that, it's emotional, right? We get a lot of emotions tied to it, and there's anxiety and all of that. And some of that is, and this is how I knew, right, that I could let myself be completely open and vulnerable with Paul, and I didn't feel like he was judging me. He didn't give me any judgment about how I spent my money in the past or all of that, but he was like, oh, but you don't have any real money, because this is all fake money. Because if you owe people, all this money, then it's like they owe you. But he didn't make me feel like there was something wrong with me and I had dated a guy who was into, investing and all of that, but it was like he had a checklist. It was like, oh, she's not good with money. You know what I mean? And there was no judgment there. It was just, we can fix this. So let me show you how I think you should fix it. And I was like, oh, okay. He could be critical without being judgmental. And that was a very important thing for me. And I think that for a lot of people, they have to feel like they're not being judged, to trust you enough to take your advice or to even hear what you're saying, because otherwise, people get very sensitive about that. It's changed so much over time. Like before, there was a time when it would have been like palm butter, no questions asked. But I don't know. Today is probably okra palava sauce or check rice and fish babies. I think that my father really took great joy in being, like the patriarch of our family, the family historian, and even beyond that, just all of his connections with the, I think it's called the Liberian Historical Society. I think that he would like to be remembered in that way as a historian. Mm-hmm.